maybe just to add to my rather embarrassing CV, that I'm actually now the resident coordinator of the UN system in Sri Lanka, which means I'm not UNICEF anymore, but I work with the whole UN system in Sri Lanka. I was going to do a presentation, and I was going to do a speech, and then I thought, oh my goodness, I'm talking to academics, and they probably don't want to travel halfway around the planet to see a PowerPoint presentation or to hear someone make a UN speech. So instead I brought you all a copy of this little booklet. And for me, this little booklet represents possibly one of the most stupidly ambitious global policy frameworks that have ever existed, and at the same time provides us with possibly the only framework for our planet. And why do I say that? I say that because many of you here are tackling the big issues of the day: nutrition, employment, climate. But all of these big issues of the day can't be tackled alone. They have to be tackled within a sustainable development framework. And a sustainable development framework is insanely complicated. It's insanely complicated. And you're all academics, so you all understand that any insanely complex framework is also insanely contested. And a framework that says as goal number 1, end poverty, and then tackles environment and tackles employment and tackles sustainable agriculture and sustainable cities and sustainable industry and nutrition and education is contested. And it will be contested from every point of view. But every country in the world has agreed on this framework. And what it does is it says, and you'll see just immediately on the second page, it says that there are 5 P's to this framework. And they're in a circle, so they don't have any priority: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And I don't know that there's anyone here from Latin America, but we heard some of the tenets of Buddhism being discussed a few minutes ago. If you take the beliefs of people from Latin America, or many of the indigenous communities from Latin America, planet is our mother. If you take many of the beliefs of Buddhism, if you take many of the beliefs of many of the religions based in reflection, the planet is our mother. Without that mother planet, you can end poverty, but you can't end misery, and you can't create sustainability. Without prosperity that allows people to thrive, that allows people to thrive not just physically and to buy the food that they want and to buy the clothes that they want and have adequate shelter. I saw someone in the abstracts is looking at mental poverty. If we don't move beyond the mental poverty that exists, what's the point of planet? What's the point of prosperity? All of this involves all of us working together to ensure those things. But if we're going to work together, as someone said earlier, you have to have peace. And without peace, none of this is really meaningful, because without peace, we continue to destroy each other, we continue to destroy our planet, and we continue to exacerbate that mental poverty. So for me, in many ways, while of course all of you probably would argue that people is the big P here. In many ways, for me, the big P is partnership. And so I'm standing here as a representative of the United Nations. You're here as representatives primarily of academia. And so rather than do anything else, I would like to throw the challenge to you, which is often difficult, which is how does academia engage with policymakers, engage with the UN, engage with non-governmental organizations, engage with the private sector on creating best practice for sustainable development. You know, as you heard from my CV, I started in the world of child protection. And one time someone very brave brought a load of practitioners from child protection together with a load of academics. And we spent 3 days fighting each other. You know, we thought that the academics didn't know anything. They weren't grounded in reality. They had no sense of purpose. They were just writing papers criticizing people. The academics said we didn't think anything through. We didn't have any rigor to what we did. We didn't have any end purpose. We were just acting for today. And after the third day, we started to talk to each other. And actually, by the fifth day, we had established good relationships. And we were able to, for those of us who were there, we weren't many, but we were about 20 practitioners and 20 academics. We were able to establish some lifelong partnerships around our work for child protection, particularly in West Africa. And some of those relationships continue today. And they've strengthened child protection work, and they've strengthened academia. And I think that the challenge for you as academics is to continue to do what you do really well, which is to challenge poverty. But to do that with the policymakers and find ways of improving how the policymakers think, how the private sector thinks, because increasingly the private sector becomes more and more important in these sustainable development goals, how the people who have to finance sustainable development think, how the UN thinks, how NGOs think, and challenging us and being challenged around sustainable development. Because these 17 goals, you're talking about poverty, number 1, and the last one is number 17, which is partnerships. But if we put them on a circle, partnerships and poverty are together. And poverty is intractable. We're not now, with these sustainable development goals, we're not talking about poor countries. We're not talking about the 4% of Sri Lankans who live in poverty, in absolute poverty. We're not talking about the percentages of people in poor countries that live in absolute poverty. The vast majority of poor people are in middle-income countries. They're in China, they're in Nigeria, they're in countries that have GDPs that don't reflect what we think of as poor countries. I see someone here from Rwanda. You know, there are countries which over a period of 15, 16 years have sustainably moved people out of poverty. It can be done. So we're not talking about the poorest countries on earth. We're talking about middle-income countries. We're talking about the US and the UK, where every single year more and more children fall into poverty. 30 million children growing up in poverty in the most developed countries in the world. This is a global compact. And you as global academics are part of that global compact to say, this is why poverty is a cancer. And that's what poverty is. Poverty is a cancer. Poverty is a shame. It's pitiful. It's disgusting. There is no reason in a world where there's so much wealth that education shouldn't be of a standard that allows people to move out of mental poverty. There's no reason why our jobs should continue to be jobs which humiliate and degrade people. It requires an agenda that says all of these 17 goals have to work together. Nutrition, well, what's the point of trying to address nutrition if you don't have good healthcare systems, if you don't have good education systems, if you don't have good jobs, if you don't have a planet that will sustain all these well-nourished people, if you don't have agricultural systems that will ensure adequate food for those who need to be taken out of poverty, if you don't have education for communities that says this is why you can't keep feeding your children fried rubbish that you buy on the side of the street. Mexico, a country that's rapidly moved out of poverty, highest child obesity in the world. Why? Because people buy food off the side of the streets for their children. Not that they don't have money to buy food, but because the education isn't there. And so, for me, these sustainable development goals, poverty and partnership, challenge every single one of us to find ways of working together. Now, I can see as academics that you can work with government. You can, particularly where there are links between research and policy, I can see that. I can see that it might be sometimes very difficult to work with the UN because we have big gates and we seem to be a little bit distant, but challenge us. I can see that sometimes the UN and others may seem a little bit distant because we're all challenged by the same lack of resources that you're challenged by. We're all challenged by having too much work. Nutrition, without tackling quality education, without tackling quality healthcare, without tackling sustainable agriculture, the private sector will never have the people they need. I look at Sri Lanka. What does the private sector want? It wants people who can speak English and it wants people who can use computers. What does the education system do? No English and no computers. So bringing that evidence to the government, to the private sector, and saying, let's sit down and talk about this. As academics, you have a really important role to play as the integrators of those who need to finance sustainable development. Because sustainable development will, if this crazy, mad idea was possible, would cost us trillions of dollars. None of you are going to be able to do that. We're certainly not going to be able to do that at the UN. But governments and the private sector have to be able to see how can they look at sustainability. So just to let you know a little bit about what the UN has been doing in Sri Lanka since the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted 2 years ago. We've been trying to support the government to define its framework for sustainable development. Which of these goals are the most important? Why are they the most important? Which of the indicators and targets would the government like to meet first? And what does that mean for what has to be done? And how does the government want to define what that means? Because it's all very well to say, we'd like to have quality healthcare, but you have to define what that means. These goals are very different to the Millennium Development Goals. They require qualitative analysis. And which of the other targets do you have to include if you're going to do that? Then we've been trying to say to the government, well, how are you going to finance it? So even though it's a first attempt, the budget in Sri Lanka, which had its first reading a month ago, was defined by the Sustainable Development Goals. It was called a blue-green budget, and it looked at planet and sea, or earth and sea, and it looked at trying to define the objectives of the budget according to the SDGs. Now that's a little bit of an exercise of fitting round pegs into square holes, but it's a beginning. And then we'll work with the government to try to ensure that the different ministries who are defining their programming for 2018-2019 understand how what they plan can contribute to the SDGs, so that the government can see where progress towards the SDGs is being defined, and they can start to try and measure it. Now, why do that? Why do it? Because the world has come together with this very, very complex and aspirational set of goals and targets, and said this is what we believe can bring us to this sustainability that's required for our people, our planet, our prosperity, our peace. And totally essential to that is partnership. So, as academia, as religious leaders, as others who provide guidance, provide knowledge, provide an analysis, I would just finish by saying, be partners for sustainable development. Knock on people's doors. Bang on people's doors if necessary, but be heard and help to frame the discussion around sustainability in such a way that all of us are working together for this crazily ridiculous and ambitious agenda. Because without it, we're not on a good path. We're not on a good path. We're not treating our planet well. We're not treating our people well. And for me, this is a secular agenda that covers the world. And as we need a global agenda, and this is the one that we have at the moment, it seems to me that we all owe it to ourselves and to our children, our future grandchildren, our nieces and nephews to give that partnership a go. So I really am very happy to have been invited here. I'm very, very pleased that you'll spend 2 days deliberating on development and poverty. And I look forward to hearing from the outcomes of the meeting, and look forward to hearing about how all of you are going to become sustainable development activists. Thank you.